Hello, YTPC. This is Willie, the volunteer piper here, and this is a VR for Steve smoking cardboard. Um, he wanted to know like an old family story that's been passed down, uh, or that our parents or was told, or our parents told us, and we remember and things like that. Mine's just a touch bit different. My parents didn't really I didn't really have a whole bunch of stories from my mom and dad that that they would always tell, and I would always remember, and then wound up telling my kids. But um, I always remember my grandmother. Now I have to do a little background. My family is older. I was adopted, and my mom and dad didn't get me until they were in their early 40s. I think my dad was like 41, 42. My mom was like in her late 30s. So my sister was 9 years older than myself. So, by the time I got out of high school and things like that, my family, like all my aunts and uncles and my grandparents and everything else, were already older, a lot older than my friends' parents and things, or most of them. So I didn't have a grandfather. My mom's dad passed away when she was little, so my mom barely knew him. So I didn't know him on my grandfather on my mom's side. And then my grandfather on my dad's side died about 15, 20 years before I was born as well. So I didn't ever have a grandfather. I did know both my grandmothers, and it's my grandmother on my mom's side that I'm going to talk about. We have a pretty large family. My dad has seven brothers and a sister, and all of them had kids. My mom had four brothers, and all of them, of course, had multiple kids. So, I had a whole bunch of cousins, and we always had a lot big family get-togethers and things like that for different holidays and so listen to a lot of stories from them, from my aunts and uncles, um, and but the ones I remember the most are my mom's mom, my grandmother on my mom's side. She passed away when I was a senior in high school back in 1987. But when she passed, she was in her mid 90s. She was like 94, 95. I can't exactly remember. But she was born in 1897. So she remembers a lot of things in history that I learned about in history class. She remembers the Titanic sinking, which was, it's, that always used to, she was like a teenager when the Titanic went down. So she always had told stories about things like that. And we'd all get around, us kids, especially, when we'd have family get together and stuff. And everybody would go to my grandmother's house and we'd have a big lunch and she would cook and we'd all hang around for a couple of days. But grandmother always used to tell us, and she lived here in Nashville, whereas all my other cousins and things lived out of town. So I was always around my grandmother a lot, going over to her house and helping her around the house. And she was really a strong lady. She had like a 2.5, 3 acre yard, and she used to mow it until she got sick. She was 91, 92 years old and still mowing the grass and push mowing, trimming the trees around the trees with the push mower. But she could do it all, and she did it all. But she used to tell us all the time, because my aunts and my uncles and things, they were all in like World War II or the Korean War. Um, and that was the two wars that they were in, because they were, by the time the Vietnam War came around, they were all too old. So they used to tell some stories about the wars and things that they were in, which was cool. But my grandmother would always say, And we'd be sitting around, and there'd be 4 or 5 of us there, and my cousins, and they're all a little bit older than me. I was the youngest one, and naturally, and so we'd sit around and be eating some kind of pie or something that my grandmother made, and she'd be telling just all kinds of stories about a neighbor that, cause she lived in the same house since like the 1930s, and she'd be telling us about a neighbor, or when my mom and my uncles were all younger, about the neighborhood and everything else that they lived in. But the coolest thing was ever that she used to tell us is that when her parents, which would be my great grandparents, when they talked about the war, they talked about the Civil War. So as I was getting stories from my aunts and from my uncles, not my aunts, but my uncles, about either World War II or the Korean War, whichever one they were in, and they'd tell us stories about their experiences in those. My grandmother would say, yeah, when we used to sit down and do this, my mom and dad and some of my cousins and things used to get stories about the Civil War, or what she called the war between the states. She never really called it the Civil War. Actually, she called it the War of Northern Aggression for the longest time. And then she finally, I don't know why she switched. I guess when I was in junior high, she started calling it the War between the states, but she never called it the Civil War. And she would tell us, it's hard to remember any exact stories about those, but she would just tell us about those times. When she was born, it was already over, of course, 1897, it was 30 years before she was born. But, my grandmother had a couple of brothers and a sister who were older than her. And one brother in particular was born in like 1870 something, like 78. So he was born just a few years after everything ended. And she would say how her dad would tell her stuff about this battle and that battle, and where they lived in Nashville was just not far away from the battle that they had marched, had been in and things. So it was really neat to hear those stories. And again, it wasn't really a story, but just hearing her every time. I mean, it was almost like clockwork. When we'd sit around and listen to my uncles talk about something that happened to them in the Navy, because most of them were in the Navy. Now, on my mom's side, all 4 of her brothers were in the Navy. So they would talk about things that happened to them in the Navy while they were in either the World War II or the Korean War. She would always come in, and it was almost like clockwork. She would come in and she'd sit down and listen for a few minutes, and she goes, well, when my parents talked about the war, they talked about the war between the states. And all my cousins, I would look at each other like, here it comes, she's going to say it. And then she would go off and say, this part of Nashville was this, and this part of Nashville was that. And like I said, I can't remember exactly all the stories she told, but it was just that she would always refer to, when her parents referred to being in the wars, or her family, like her uncles and things, and they were always talking about the Civil War. And it was funny because we'd always say, grandmother, don't you mean? And yes, I had to call her grandmother. She wouldn't let us call her grandma or granny or anything like that. We'd get in very bad trouble. We had to call her grandmother. So we'd say, grandmother, don't you mean the Civil War? And she's like, Civil War? She goes, that was a northern term. She goes, down here it was the war between the states. And then, of course, we'd say, well, don't you mean the war of northern aggression? She would be, ah, she goes, that's what it was called down here. But she goes, we changed and we now call it the war between the states. I was like, okay, well, that's fine. So she would tell us, some things about that. And she would tell us some stories about her growing up here in Nashville and how Nashville was back in the early 1900s and things like that. Which, again, I don't remember a lot of those because she used to, it wasn't like a story, but she just tell us facts about the city. Like, this didn't exist, or this wasn't here, or, things like that. So, and so I tell my kids all the time, again, by the time I had children, a lot of my aunts and uncles had already passed, just from, from being so much older. But, my sister and I would, when we'd get to each other with my kids and things, and we'd start talking about some old family member being in the war, we'd always eventually tell my kids. My sister doesn't have any kids, but we'd always say, your great grandmother used to tell us stories about her parents being in the Civil War. And they would all like, ooh, wow, that's crazy. And yeah, so they've heard it 1,000 times too. I would, every time something came up about a war, it would always come up that my great grandparents were, fought in the Civil War or fought in the war between the states. So they've known that. And my son, not as much now because he's in his 20s and he's doing his thing, but he used to be kind of like a little Civil War. He used to like reading about it and things like that. So he would always, hopefully he'll get back into that. He's doing his thing now that he's in the 20s. So it's not cool to do a whole bunch of research and things and read. So, he'd rather be fishing. But anyway, I used to do a lot of reading about the Civil War, and I did too a little bit. My favorite subject of that or my favorite time period is World War II, and I've done a lot of reading and research and things on that, and it's really neat. But and the Civil War is kind of cool too. Living here in Nashville, there's a lot of history here with the Civil War, so we're kind of blessed because things are so close here. There's a lot of things happening around the Nashville area that you can just go to, like the Franklin area, which is just a little bit south of here. Has a lot of his history when it comes to the Civil War. And so yeah, that's really it. It's not really a certain story per se that I was told over and over again. It was just that my grandmother would always tell us that, when my family talked about the war, they were talking about the war between the states. So it was always cool. It always just blew our minds. We were like, wow, that's so cool. That was so long ago. You're so old. Which she was, but and she knew it, but we couldn't tell her that. But anyway, that's it. I hope this qualifies. So I know it's not like a certain story. I know that's what you were wanting. And sorry, I'm not smoking a pipe right now. I've been working out in the yard, and I've got to go run some errands here in a few minutes. But thank you for listening, and sorry this is so late. And I'll, like I said, I'll submit this for entry. Steve, great guy, great channel. I love watching your videos. And folks, if you watch this and you're not subscribed to Smoking Cardboard, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button on his channel. He's a great guy and has a great channel and puts out some great content. So, Steve, thank you again, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye now.